It began like any ordinary day, but by the end of it, the truth would unravel one of the most bizarre identity mix-ups in recent history. A man believed to be dead would attend his own funeral, and a grieving family would find out the person they mourned was a stranger. This isn't fiction. This is the hauntingly real case of Jerry Smith and Marcus Daniels, two men whose lives unknowingly collided in a moment of chaos, confusion, and irreversible consequence. In 2005, a car accident on a rain-slicked highway in Indiana left one man dead and another critically injured. Emergency responders arrived at the scene to find the wreckage engulfed in steam, twisted metal scattered across the road. Inside the vehicle were two young men, both in their 20s, both without any form of ID. One of the men was pronounced dead at the scene. The other, barely clinging to life, was rushed to the hospital. Due to the severity of his injuries, a broken jaw, swollen face, and multiple fractures, the hospital staff relied on assumptions and verbal confirmation from a panicked friend who arrived shortly after. Based on limited clothing descriptions and a tattoo they believed was unique, the unconscious man was identified as Jerry Smith. The dead man, never formally identified before burial, was assumed to be Marcus Daniels. For the next 5 weeks, Jerry's family maintained a constant vigil beside the man in the hospital bed. They talked to him, prayed for him, held his hand. They believed he was improving. They even began preparing for his homecoming. And all the while, Marcus Daniels' family had already buried their son, held a funeral, and attempted to grieve the unimaginable. But behind the scenes, questions were brewing. The man in the hospital wasn't responding the way doctors expected. He wasn't reacting to Jerry's favorite songs or recognizing familiar faces. One nurse quietly voiced concern, saying his behavioral patterns didn't match with what she'd seen in Jerry's old videos shown to her by the family. Then came the moment that changed everything. As the man in the hospital began to regain partial consciousness, a nurse leaned in and asked softly, "Do you know your name?" The man, slurring and weak, muttered, "Marcus." Shock tore through the room. For a moment, the nurse thought he was confused. Brain trauma? Disorientation, maybe? But then he repeated it. Marcus, not Jerry. DNA testing was ordered immediately. Samples from the living man and the deceased were both examined. Days later, the results confirmed what the nurse had feared. The man lying in the hospital for weeks was not Jerry Smith. It was Marcus Daniels. And the man who had been buried 5 weeks earlier? That was Jerry Smith. The mistake unraveled a web of sorrow, confusion, and disbelief. Jerry Smith had been misidentified and buried under someone else's name. His family had spent weeks talking to a stranger, hoping, crying, and celebrating milestones with a person who was not their son. Meanwhile, Marcus's family had mourned his death, never realizing he was still alive, injured, unconscious, and in desperate need of familiar voices. The media erupted when the story came to light. Headlines read, "Man attends his own funeral, and funeral for the wrong man." Interviews followed, both families recounting the emotional roller coaster of grief and revelation. But beneath the sensationalism was a quieter, more painful reality. Two families forever changed by a simple error. An error rooted in haste, fear, and the chaos of trauma care. The Smith family had to come to terms with the devastating truth that their son had died on the highway that night, and they hadn't even known it. The goodbye they thought they were getting had never truly happened. For the Daniels family, the journey was equally haunting. Their son was alive, yes, but they had abandoned him in his most vulnerable state, misled by a chain of mistaken identity that robbed them of precious time. Marcus, once fully recovered, struggled with the psychological aftermath. He remembered fragments of the crash, the darkness, and waking up to unfamiliar voices calling him by the wrong name. In interviews, he described the experience as waking up in someone else's life. And in a way, he had. The hospital and emergency responders came under scrutiny, though no formal charges were filed. Policies on patient identification were revisited across the state. New protocols were established, requiring multiple points of verification before declarations of death or long-term care identification could be made. But protocols couldn't undo what had been done. A man had been buried without his name. Another had almost lost his life while his real family mourned him from afar. And two families had to live with the irreversible emotional whiplash of loving and losing the wrong person. The funeral Jerry Smith was supposed to have became a symbolic moment. After the truth was revealed, the Daniels family invited the Smiths to attend a memorial together. This time for Jerry, properly named, properly remembered. Marcus stood in that service, alive, surrounded by two grieving families, connected by tragedy, separated by one irreversible mistake. And in that strange, painful reunion, he attended the funeral of a man whose life had become entangled with his own, and who, in death, had shared his name. Switched at death. A phrase that once sounded like fiction, now served as a reminder of how fragile identity, memory, and even truth can be in the face of human error. And though the story faded from the front pages, its impact lingered, in policy, in practice, and in the haunting memories of two families who learned that sometimes, the most painful part of grief is discovering you've been grieving the wrong goodbye. But what happened afterward is what truly deepened the mystery. Marcus found himself caught between two lives, the one he thought he had lost and the one he was mistakenly given. He experienced an identity crisis unlike any other, now forever linked to the man who shared his final moments. He started having vivid dreams of the crash and of Jerry. In them, Jerry never speaks, just stands silently in the distance, as if watching. Marcus began journaling, trying to untangle what this strange connection meant. He spoke at schools and hospitals about the importance of identification protocols, becoming an advocate for medical safety, all while still processing the trauma he barely survived. As for Jerry's family, they created a scholarship fund in his memory, using donations that had originally been meant for his recovery. It became a quiet way to ensure that his name lived on, properly remembered, never misnamed again. Years later, when a documentary crew followed up on the story, Marcus agreed to participate, but only under one condition: that Jerry's story be told in full. He deserves that, he said. He lost everything, including his own name. At the very least, people should know who he really was. In a final interview, Marcus looked into the camera and said, "Every time someone calls me Marcus, I remember the moment I said that name. I wasn't just correcting a mistake. I was waking up to my own life. But part of me is still there, in that hospital bed, confused, under someone else's name." What happened between Jerry and Marcus wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was a glimpse into how fragile our connections really are, how easily the truth can be buried, quite literally, and how, in the end, even the living can carry the ghosts of those whose stories were miswritten. Because sometimes, the scariest part of a mystery isn't who disappeared. It's the realization that the wrong person came back.